He thought he was about to frighten a maid into silence, but before the night was over, she would say 12 words that would follow him into every room he entered. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe dignity and truth matter more than power, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Richard Castellano. The rain fell steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Castellano estate, turning the Chicago skyline into a blur of silver lights and shadows. Inside the mansion, everything was quiet except for the low murmur of voices coming from the private conference room on the second floor. Richard Castellano sat at the head of a long walnut table, his expression unreadable as trusted advisors discussed business matters that never appeared on paper. At 38 years old, Richard had built a reputation that made people choose their words carefully around him. He was a man accustomed to certainty, a man accustomed to being obeyed, and most importantly, a man accustomed to knowing exactly who stood on his side and who did not. The meeting ended shortly after 9 o'clock. Chairs slid back. Expensive watches caught the warm light from the chandeliers. One by one, the men left the room until Richard remained alone, reviewing a collection of documents spread across the polished table. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over Lake Michigan. Richard rubbed his eyes. It had been a long day, longer than most. As he gathered the papers into a leather folder, something caught his attention. A faint sound, not loud enough to be alarming, just enough to make him pause. He turned toward the doorway. The conference room door stood slightly open. A narrow beam of light stretched across the hallway carpet. Richard frowned. The room had been closed throughout the meeting. Nobody was supposed to be nearby. Rising from his chair, he crossed the room with slow, measured steps. His polished shoes barely made a sound against the hardwood floor. The hallway beyond was empty at first glance. Then he noticed movement near the far end. A woman stood beside a service cart holding cleaning supplies. Naomi Carter, 29 years old. Housemaid. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible. She had worked at the estate for 8 months, and during that time Richard had spoken to her perhaps 3 times. She kept her head down, did her job, never asked questions, never lingered where she didn't belong. Until tonight. Richard's eyes narrowed. The service cart stood parked unusually close to the conference room, closer than it should have been. Naomi appeared to be dusting a decorative shelf, but something about the timing felt wrong. The coincidence felt too convenient. Naomi. His voice cut through the hallway. She turned immediately. Yes, Mr. Castellano? Her tone was calm, respectful, steady. Richard studied her face. Most employees became visibly nervous when he addressed them directly. Naomi did not. She simply waited. How long have you been standing here? He asked. About 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Yes, sir. Richard took another step forward. The air seemed heavier now. Interesting. Naomi said nothing. Richard glanced toward the conference room behind him, then back at her. You know, he said slowly, people often get themselves into trouble when they become curious. Naomi remained still. I wasn't curious, sir. No. No, thunder echoed outside. Richard folded his arms. The problem is, Naomi, some conversations aren't meant for everyone. She nodded once. I understand. Do you? His voice sharpened slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were close enough to hear things that don't concern you. The hallway fell silent. Somewhere downstairs, a grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour. Naomi lowered the dust cloth into her cart. Not hurried, not frightened, just deliberate. Richard watched her carefully. Most people rush to explain themselves when confronted. Most people stumbled over words. Naomi simply met his gaze. Mr. Castellano, she said quietly, I wasn't listening. Richard's expression hardened. That would be easier to believe if you weren't standing outside a private meeting. The rain intensified against the windows. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Richard delivered the sentence he often used when he wanted a conversation to end. The sentence that usually drained all confidence from the person standing across from him. Some people have ruined their lives by knowing too much. His voice remained calm, controlled, almost polite. Somehow that made it feel colder. It's wise to remember that. The warning hung in the air between them. Naomi looked at him, really looked at him. Not as an employee looks at an employer. Not as a maid looks at the owner of the house. Her dark eyes held something unexpected. Not fear, not defiance. Something far more unsettling. Understanding. Then she spoke. Quietly. Almost gently. No, Mr. Castellano. Richard froze. Naomi's voice never rose. People ruin their lives when they trust the wrong person. The hallway went completely silent. Richard felt something shift inside him. Because those exact words had been spoken earlier that morning in a private conversation that only 4 people should have known about. 4 people. And Naomi Carter was not one of them. For the first time that evening, Richard Castellano found himself staring at the maid not with authority, but with a question he could not answer. Richard Castellano did not move. The rain continued tapping against the glass, and somewhere beyond the estate grounds a distant siren faded into the night. But inside the hallway, everything felt strangely still. Naomi's words echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. People ruin their lives when they trust the wrong person. It was not simply the sentence itself that bothered him. It was the fact that he had heard those exact words less than 12 hours earlier. At 8:30 that morning, during a private breakfast meeting downtown, an aging financial advisor named Arthur Bennett had spoken them quietly across a corner table. There had been no staff nearby. No assistants, no employees, just 4 men discussing concerns that never left locked rooms. Richard studied Naomi carefully. Her expression revealed nothing. No satisfaction, no fear, no sign that she understood why those words had affected him. That almost made it worse. "Who told you that?" he asked. Naomi blinked. "Told me what, sir?" "The sentence you just said." "Nobody told me." Richard stared at her. "Do not insult my intelligence." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "I am not trying to insult you." The answer was calm, respectful, yet somehow it felt stronger than an argument. Richard folded his arms tighter across his chest. Throughout his life, he had learned that people usually revealed themselves under pressure. Fear made them careless. Nervousness made them talk. But Naomi seemed unaffected by either. "You expect me to believe that was a coincidence?" he asked. "I do not know what you heard before tonight." Her voice remained steady. "I only said what seemed true." Richard felt a flicker of irritation. Not because she was disrespectful, because she was not. Every answer was measured, thoughtful, almost impossible to challenge directly. For several seconds he said nothing. Naomi reached for the handle of her cleaning cart. "If there is nothing else, Mr. Castellano, I should finish my work." Most people would have hurried away. Naomi simply waited. Richard noticed something then. The hallway lights reflected softly across the polished floor, and in that reflection, he could see her watching him. Not nervously, not aggressively, carefully, as though she were studying a puzzle. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Tell me something," he said. Naomi stopped. "Yes, sir." "Why did you say it?" She considered the question. "Because you sounded certain." Richard frowned. "Certain about what?" "About danger." Her answer came immediately. People who are certain about danger usually spend too much time looking in one direction. Richard felt his jaw tighten. "Meaning?" Naomi glanced toward the conference room. "Meaning the thing you worry about most is rarely the thing that surprises you." Silence settled between them again. Thunder rolled softly across the city. Richard could not explain why the conversation bothered him so much. Every word sounded simple, ordinary even. Yet each answer seemed to land exactly where his confidence lived. Finally, Naomi gave a small nod. "Good night, Mr. Castellano." She pushed the service cart down the hallway and disappeared around the corner. Richard remained where he was. Minutes passed before he realized he was still staring at the empty corridor. Then, for the first time in years, a question entered his mind and refused to leave. How did a maid see things that everyone else seemed to miss? Richard Castellano slept poorly. That alone would have surprised anyone who knew him. He was not a man easily disturbed. Years of responsibility had trained him to separate emotion from judgment, concern from action. Yet when dawn arrived over Chicago and pale sunlight filtered through the curtains of his bedroom, Naomi Carter's words were still sitting in the back of his mind. "The thing you worry about most is rarely the thing that surprises you." He replayed the conversation while knotting his tie. He replayed it while drinking coffee in his private study. By 8 o'clock, he had reached a conclusion he did not particularly like. Either Naomi was extraordinarily perceptive, or something about her story did not add up. Neither possibility made him comfortable. At 9:15, he summoned Michael Graves, the head of estate security. Michael had worked for Richard for nearly 12 years. Reliable, efficient, the kind of man who noticed details others ignored. If there was something unusual about Naomi Carter, Michael would find it. "I want a complete review," Richard said from behind his desk. Employment history, financial records, references, everything. Michael raised an eyebrow. The maid. Richard disliked how strange the request sounded when spoken aloud. Just do it. Michael nodded. You think she is a problem? Richard stared at the city beyond the window. I think she knows things she should not know. By late afternoon, a thick folder rested on Richard's desk. He opened it expecting complications, hidden connections, suspicious activity, maybe an unexplained relationship buried somewhere in her past. Instead, he found disappointment. Naomi Carter, born in Cleveland, Ohio, raised by a single mother, graduated high school with honors, worked part-time jobs through college before leaving during her junior year. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no unusual financial activity, no connections to anyone on Richard's radar. The report was almost painfully ordinary. Richard flipped through every page twice. Nothing stood out. No secret, no mystery, no explanation. The woman who had unsettled him the night before appeared completely unremarkable on paper. And somehow that bothered him even more. Around 6 o'clock that evening, Richard crossed the main foyer on his way to dinner when he noticed movement near the front entrance. 2 security employees stood speaking quietly beside a delivery log. One of them was Daniel Reeves, a younger guard hired 3 months earlier. Naomi was nearby polishing a console table beneath a large mirror. Richard barely paid attention until he heard her voice. You should check that shipment again. Daniel looked confused. What shipment? The wine delivery from this afternoon. Daniel laughed politely. Why? Naomi set down her cloth. Because the numbers do not match. The guard exchanged an amused glance with his coworker. You counted the cases? No, then how would you know? Naomi looked toward the loading dock doors. Because the driver signed with his left hand, but every previous signature in the book was written with his right. Daniel blinked. The smile disappeared from his face. You noticed that? It seemed unusual. 10 minutes later, curiosity got the better of him. Daniel reopened the shipment records. 20 minutes after that, Richard watched from the balcony above as the security team discovered an administrative error that would have caused several expensive cases to be sent to the wrong location. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just a mistake. Yet Naomi had spotted it before anyone else. Richard stood silently, overlooking the foyer below. Naomi had already returned to her work. She did not wait for recognition. She did not mention being right. She simply continued dusting furniture as though nothing had happened. And for the second time in less than 24 hours, Richard found himself asking the same question. What exactly was everyone missing when they looked at Naomi Carter? The following week should have returned life at the estate to normal, but it did not. Richard began noticing a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Naomi never inserted herself into conversations. She never volunteered opinions. Yet somehow unusual observations kept finding their way to her. On Tuesday morning, the head accountant spent nearly an hour searching for a discrepancy buried inside a quarterly report. Several managers reviewed the numbers without finding the problem. Naomi happened to be cleaning the executive dining room when the discussion drifted through the open doorway. She paused for only a moment before quietly saying, "The percentage in section 4 does not match the total on the previous page." Nobody responded at first. Then the accountant checked. She was right. The error was small, but correcting it prevented a chain of mistakes that would have affected several departments. On Wednesday afternoon, Richard watched another incident unfold. A vendor arrived 20 minutes late for a scheduled meeting and immediately blamed traffic. Everyone seemed willing to accept the explanation except Naomi. She happened to be replacing fresh flowers in the foyer when the man walked through the entrance. As he passed, she glanced briefly at his shoes. Nothing more. Later that evening, she crossed paths with Michael Graves and quietly remarked, "He was not delayed by traffic." Michael frowned. "How do you know?" Naomi adjusted a vase on a side table. "Because his shoes were perfectly clean. It has been raining for 6 hours." Michael dismissed the comment at first. Yet the next day, the vendor admitted he had actually stopped for another meeting before arriving at the estate. Again, Naomi had been correct. Richard found himself watching these moments from a distance. Not because he distrusted her anymore. If anything, the opposite was becoming true. What unsettled him was how she reached conclusions that everyone else missed. One Thursday evening, he stood in the library pretending to read while Naomi dusted shelves nearby. The room glowed with warm amber light. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Richard closed the book in his hands. You notice things. Naomi continued working. Most people do. Not like you. She smiled. Faintly. Most people notice more than they think. They just stop paying attention. Richard leaned back in his chair. And you never stop? Naomi considered the question. When I was younger, my mother used to tell me something. Her voice remained soft. She said people reveal themselves long before they speak. Richard watched her carefully. What does that mean? Naomi dusted the final shelf and stepped back. It means people tell you who they are through habits, timing, expressions, and choices. She glanced toward him. Words usually come later. Richard felt a strange sensation settle over him. Not fear, not suspicion, something closer to discomfort. Because the more he listened to Naomi, the more he realized how often he relied on confidence, reputation, and loyalty when judging people. Naomi seemed to trust something entirely different. Observation. As she gathered her supplies to leave, she paused near the doorway. Mr. Castellano? Yes. Her expression changed slightly. The warmth disappeared. There is someone around you who is pretending to be less nervous than they really are. Richard frowned. Who? Naomi shook her head. I do not know yet. Then she looked directly into his eyes. But when people become afraid of losing something, they usually start making mistakes. The room fell silent. Naomi left without another word. Richard remained alone in the library, staring at the doorway long after she disappeared. Because deep down, a thought had begun taking shape. And for the first time, he was no longer wondering whether Naomi Carter saw things others missed. He was beginning to wonder what she would see next. The following Monday began with an unusual invitation. Richard Castellano asked Naomi to join him for coffee in the library. The request traveled through the estate faster than any official announcement. Staff members exchanged confused glances. Security personnel quietly speculated. Nobody could remember the last time Richard had invited a member of the household staff into a private conversation. Naomi arrived exactly on time. She wore the same simple navy uniform she always wore and carried herself with the same quiet composure. Nothing about her suggested she understood how unusual the situation had become. Richard gestured toward a chair across from him. Sit. Naomi hesitated briefly before taking a seat. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting pale gold across rows of leather-bound books. For a moment, neither spoke. Richard studied her carefully. The more he learned about Naomi Carter, the less sense she made. Her file said she was ordinary. Her observations suggested otherwise. Tell me something, Richard finally said. How do you do it? Naomi tilted her head slightly. Do what? Notice things everyone else misses. A faint smile touched her face. I'm not sure I notice more. Richard almost laughed. That is difficult to believe. Naomi looked toward the windows. Most people see what they expect to see. And you do not. I try not to. Richard leaned forward. That sounds simple. It is simple. She folded her hands in her lap. Simple does not mean easy. The answer lingered in the room. Richard found himself listening more carefully than he intended. Naomi continued. People often decide who someone is before they have enough information. Everyone does that. Yes. Her eyes met his. That is usually where mistakes begin. Richard felt an uncomfortable truth hidden inside those words. Throughout his career, he had judged people quickly. Confidence, loyalty, competence, weakness. He believed he could read a room within minutes. It was one of the reasons he had become successful. Yet recently Naomi had exposed flaws in that certainty without ever directly challenging him. Before Richard could respond, a knock interrupted the conversation. Michael Graves entered carrying a folder. Sorry to interrupt. He placed the folder on the table. The meeting downtown was moved from Wednesday to Tuesday. Richard nodded. Anything else? Michael hesitated. Actually, yes. He opened the folder. One of our consultants requested access to financial records earlier than expected. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It lasted less than a second. Richard noticed anyway. Something wrong, he asked. Naomi looked at the folder. Maybe nothing. Michael crossed his arms. What does that mean? Naomi chose her words carefully. The consultant. Mr. Turner. Michael frowned. What about him? Naomi glanced between them. He has been arriving earlier every visit. And people usually move closer to something when they are preparing to leave it. Silence settled across the library. Michael looked confused. Richard felt that familiar sensation return. The feeling that Naomi was seeing a picture nobody else could see yet. You think he is planning something? Michael asked. Naomi shook her head. I think he is worried. Richard stared at her. About what? Naomi looked down at the folder resting on the table. Then she spoke quietly. That is the question he does not want anyone asking. Richard should have dismissed Naomi's observation. It was vague, incomplete, based on intuition rather than evidence. Yet over the next several days, he found himself paying closer attention to Thomas Turner than ever before. Turner had worked with his organization for nearly 6 years. He was professional, organized, and consistently dependable. On paper, he represented exactly the type of person Richard trusted. That was what made Naomi's comment so irritating. The more Richard examined Turner, the more he expected to prove her wrong. Instead, small details began surfacing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would concern anyone else. Turner started arriving earlier than necessary and leaving later than usual. During meetings, he asked questions he had never asked before. Questions about future plans, expansion projects, long-term financial commitments. Individually, each question seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern Richard could not ignore. On Friday afternoon, Richard sat alone in his office reviewing reports when a soft knock came at the door. Naomi stepped inside carrying a tray with coffee. You can leave it there, Richard said. Naomi placed the tray on a side table. As she turned to leave, Richard surprised himself. Wait. She stopped. Yes, Mr. Castellano. Richard leaned back in his chair. You never answered my question. Naomi looked puzzled. Which question? How did you learn to read people like this? For a moment she seemed uncertain whether to answer. Then she sat in the chair opposite his desk. It was the first time she had ever done so without being asked twice. Sunlight filtered through the windows behind her, illuminating dust particles floating through the air. When I was 19, Naomi began quietly, I studied behavioral psychology. Richard blinked. That was not the answer he expected. You were in college? Naomi nodded. For 3 years. What happened? A shadow crossed her face. Life happened. Richard did not press further. Something told him the story carried more pain than she wished to share. Naomi folded her hands together. One professor taught us something I never forgot. He said that people rarely hide their intentions. They hide their reasons. Richard listened carefully. What does that mean? It means most people tell you exactly what they are doing. Her voice remained calm. The difficult part is understanding why. Richard stared at her. Suddenly many things began making sense. The observations, the patterns, the strange accuracy. Naomi was not guessing. She was studying people the same way others studied numbers or contracts. So you analyze everyone? Richard asked. A faint smile appeared. Not everyone. Who then? Naomi looked directly at him. The people who seemed the most certain. The answer lingered between them. Richard felt an unexpected chill. Because he realized she was not talking about Turner. She was talking about him. As Naomi stood to leave, her gaze shifted briefly toward a framed photograph on Richard's desk. A picture taken years earlier with several trusted associates standing beside him. Her expression changed. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. Mr. Castellano, she said softly. Be careful who you mistake for loyalty. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Naomi looked at the photograph one final time. Sometimes the people closest to us become invisible. Then she walked out of the office. Richard remained motionless, staring at the picture. For the first time, he was not looking at old friends. He was looking at a group of people and wondering which one Naomi had noticed before anyone else. 3 days later, Richard finally did something he would have considered unthinkable a month earlier. He began quietly reviewing the people he trusted most. Not because he wanted to, because Naomi's words refused to leave him alone. Sometimes the people closest to us become invisible. The sentence followed him through meetings, phone calls, and long evenings in his office. He found himself paying attention to details he normally ignored. A hesitation before an answer. A glance exchanged across a room. A question that seemed harmless until viewed alongside 10 others. The more he observed, the more uncomfortable he became. On Thursday afternoon, Thomas Turner attended a strategy meeting with several senior advisors. Richard sat at the head of the table while sunlight reflected off the Chicago skyline beyond the windows. Turner appeared as polished and professional as always. Yet something felt different. Every time future projects were discussed, Turner became unusually attentive. Every mention of financial restructuring seemed to capture his full concentration. Most people would have interpreted that as dedication. Richard was no longer sure. After the meeting ended, he remained seated while the others filed out. Answer immediately. Instead, she placed a bottle of cleaning solution onto a shelf and thought carefully. Itself. A cancel meeting here. That moment, Richard realized something that unsettled him more than any document on his desk. Naomi had never been trying to convince him of anything. She had only been asking him to pay attention. The truth had been sitting in front of him the entire time. The only difference was that now he could finally see it. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the Castellano estate felt different. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the routines had changed. But because Richard Castellano had changed. Certain partnerships had quietly ended. Certain responsibilities had been reassigned. Certain assumptions had been abandoned. The process had been handled carefully, professionally, and without public drama. Yet the lesson remained. Trust was valuable. Blind trust was dangerous. On a cool autumn evening, Richard stood alone in the library looking out at the city lights. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the glass, millions of windows glowing against the darkness. For most of his life, he had believed power came from control. Control of information. Control of resources. Control of people. Recently, he had discovered something uncomfortable. Control meant very little if a person stopped seeing clearly. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Naomi stepped into the room carrying a stack of freshly organized books. "I can come back later," she said. Richard shook his head. "No. Stay." Naomi placed the books on a nearby table. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Months earlier, it would have been awkward. Now it felt natural. Richard looked toward her. "There is something I have wanted to ask you." Naomi smiled faintly. "Only one thing." Richard actually laughed. The sound surprised both of them. "Fair enough." He folded his arms. "How did you know?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Know what?" "About Victor." She was quiet for several seconds. "I did not know." Richard frowned. "Then why did you warn me?" Naomi walked slowly toward the window. The city lights reflected softly in the glass. "Because people reveal themselves." Richard waited. Naomi continued. "Victor always spoke about loyalty." "Yes. More than anyone else." Richard nodded. "And?" Naomi looked out at the skyline. "People rarely advertise the qualities they truly possess." The answer settled heavily in the room. Richard thought back through years of conversations. Years of speeches. Years of promises. Suddenly he saw them differently. "You saw that?" he asked. Naomi shrugged gently. "I paid attention." Silence followed. Then Richard asked the question that had been bothering him from the beginning. "Why did you help me?" Naomi turned toward him. Her expression remained calm. "Because you were looking in the wrong direction." Richard stared at her. "After everything I said to you that night?" Naomi smiled. "Especially because of that night." Richard remembered the hallway. The warning. The certainty in his own voice. He remembered assuming he understood exactly who Naomi Carter was. Just a maid. Just another employee. Just another invisible person moving through the background of his life. He felt embarrassed by the memory now. "I misjudged you," he admitted quietly. Naomi's smile softened. "Most people did." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not as an employer acknowledging an employee. Not as a powerful man acknowledging someone beneath him. But as one person recognizing the value of another. Outside, the city continued glowing beneath the night sky. Inside, the library remained perfectly still. And that day, Richard Castellano finally understood something that power had never taught him. The wisest person in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes she is the one everyone stopped noticing. The room went silent. And for the first time in years, Richard was grateful that someone had dared to tell him the truth.